Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In our previous lecture, we talked about the World War II era in Vietnam and the rise of the Viet Minh and its military wing, the People's Liberation Force. In this lecture, we'll continue talking about the World War II period and particularly the role of the Americans as the war went on. While von Nguyen Giap worked on forming the People's Liberation Force and the military aspect of the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh went back to China in 1942 to win assistance for his movement. It is at that time that he changed his name one last time to Ho Chi Minh, he who enlightens. In August 1942, though, he was arrested by Chinese warlords who thought they might win Vietnam for themselves and didn't want Ho to succeed. After holding him for 13 months, the warlords accepted that he might be able to do some good for them and released him. Thus, the Chinese began to supply Ho with money and supplies in exchange for information about the Japanese, with which he began to create a strong underground network. Again, this is important to note because this relationship with China carries on through the war against the French and eventually against the Americans. From the American perspective, the fall of France in World War II was problematic. FDR recognized Vichy France and the attempt to uphold colonies everywhere as a buffer against Germany and Japan. Still, FDR was angered that the French didn't put up more of a fight against Japan. He took the Japanese invasion of Indochina as a clear sign of further conquest to come. So he issued an embargo of Japan and demanded withdrawal of Japan from Indochina. The Japanese response, of course, was Pearl Harbor, and the full-blown involvement of the Americans was inevitable after that. The first U.S. military intervention into Vietnam came in early 1942 as an effort to cut the Japanese lifeline of oil and raw materials from Indochina. This became the major objective of the Flying Tigers, an American volunteer group led by General Claire L. Chennault, operating under the control of the Chinese Nationalist Army. They began attacking Japanese airfields in North Vietnam. Roosevelt was also anti-imperialist and envisioned Asia as part of an international trusteeship until it could become independent. In 1944, FDR said, "France has had the country, 30 million inhabitants, for nearly 100 years, and the people are worse off than they were at the beginning. France has milked it for 100 years. The people of Indochina are entitled to something better than that." Nearing the end of 1944, the situation began to change. The Japanese were weakening as the United States closed in on Japan. The United States and British were driving back Japan in Southeast Asia, reclaiming territories that had been lost several years before. And the United States began launching air raids into Japan itself. The French, with their homeland nearing freedom after the Normandy invasion, began to envision a role in the post-war world. Early in 1945, General Charles de Gaulle began to paratroop troops and supplies into Indochina, preparing for an attack against the Japanese. But on March 9, 1945, the Japanese preempted their attack and attacked the French. There was little resistance, as they were once again routed by the Japanese. Most of the French soldiers were imprisoned. Others fled and made their way into China. It seemed to be the end of French sovereignty in Indochina. The Japanese reinstalled Emperor Bao Dai, who sensed that the Japanese would soon fall and leave his government with little footing. With the Japanese now once again totally in control in Indochina, Ho Chi Minh found that he had a new ally, the Americans. American Army officers sought out Ho and made him a similar deal as the Chinese, In exchange for information about the Japanese, they would provide him with money and supplies. And so, during this period late in World War II, the Viet Minh offered information to the Americans about the Japanese, and they also offered assistance to downed American pilots. In exchange, the Americans offered money and supplies to the Viet Minh and began training Viet Minh for operations against the Japanese. Ho was even named an OSS agent, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS Agent 19. At one point, the Americans dropped 5,000 weapons for the Viet Minh. Of course, it is somewhat ironic that years later, these World War II allies became the bitterest of enemies, and in fact, the Viet Minh were probably using some of those very same weapons provided by the Americans against them early in their war. With allies in both China and the United States, Ho and the Viet Minh gained tremendously in prestige, support, and power during this period, and winning recruits was easier all the time in the late World War II years. The Viet Minh also benefited from their actions during a terrible famine that engulfed northern Vietnam. The Japanese exacerbated the famine. They forced many Vietnamese to grow less rice, instead growing hemp, beans, and other things to supply the Japanese war effort. So food supplies were short anyway. Then, poor weather conditions led to a dismal crop in 1945. What rice there was taken by the Japanese in anticipation of an invasion by Allied forces. It is estimated that some 2 million out of the 10 million people in North Vietnam died during this famine. It might have been even worse, but Viet Minh soldiers succeeded in breaking into some of the storage depots and distributing the rice to the peasants. The famine encouraged deep hatred and resentment of the Japanese, as well as further support of the Viet Minh. In August 1945, Ho and the Viet Minh had an opportunity to capitalize on both sentiments. After the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan early that month, Japanese hold on Indochina grew tenuous. The Japanese surrendered to the Americans on August 14th. 2 days later, on August 16th, Ho called for a general revolution against the Japanese. On August 19th, Viet Minh troops marched into Hanoi and occupied government buildings. Revolutionary committees took over provincial governments throughout the country, and within just a few days, the Viet Minh gained control of the entire country. Between August 18th and 28th, they took control of the entire country of Vietnam. This is the August Revolution. The Viet Minh ousted Emperor Bao Dai, a relic of the earlier French occupation, who had been kept in place by the Japanese. His willingness to serve foreigners left him with no credibility. Bao Dai cabled back to de Gaulle, advising him against sending any more troops. He said, "You could understand even better if you were able to see what is happening here. If you were able to sense the desire for independence that has been smoldering in the bottom of all hearts, and which no human force can any longer hold back. Even if you were to arrive to re-establish a French administration here, it would no longer be obeyed. Each village would be a nest of resistance, every former friend and enemy, and your officials and colonials themselves would ask to depart from this unbreathable atmosphere." On August 30th, the Viet Minh established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh as president. On September 2nd, he greeted a huge crowd of some 500,000 people gathered in Hanoi. He declared the independence of Vietnam, using language borrowed from the Declaration of Independence. During that speech, Ho said, "We hold these truths that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The French have fled. The Japanese have capitulated. Emperor Bao Dai has abdicated. Our people have broken down the fetters which for over a century have tied us down. Our people have at the same time overthrown the monarchic constitution that reigned supreme for so many centuries, and instead have established the present republican government. There was much American symbolism. United States aircraft flew overhead, and the Star-Spangled Banner played. Ho hoped that the Americans would honor the democratic principle of self-determination this time. He would, once again, be disappointed. No other nation officially recognized Ho's government. FDR at first seemed to support Vietnamese nationalism, but always envisioned a world controlled by the great powers. And with FDR's death, the presidency passed to Harry Truman, who had no time to learn the details about Vietnam. He was dealing with many other post-war issues and not terribly concerned with this far-flung, tiny Asian country. Truman was most interested in seeing the restoration of a powerful France. He supported the French control of Vietnam and believed it would be a good buffer against the growing Soviet Union. No one knew it in the summer of 1945, but it would be another 30 years before Vietnam would consolidate the independence it declared that August.